Welcome to Illinois Lawmakers' weekly coverage of the spring session of the Illinois General Assembly. I'm Jak Tichenor along with Peter Hancock of our partner organization, Capital News Illinois. Peter, good to have you back on the program.
Thanks, Jak.
Halfway through session now, I asked you before we got to the speaker's gallery about the mood of the place, and you said it in one word: it's kind of weird. What is setting this session apart from others you've covered here?
Well, every session kind of has its own personality, its own rhythm, its own pace, and this one seems to have having a hard time getting started or taking shape. Part of that, I think, a large part of that has to do with the new administration in Washington and just this constant barrage day after day after day of major announcements, executive orders, policy changes, many of which have a direct impact on state government.
And one of those that we saw in the last few days was the Trump administration impacted the Department of Health and Human Services in the state of Illinois. I think it was to the tune of about $477 million. There are also cuts to the State Board of Education. And as you say, every agency seems to be waiting for the next shoe to drop.
That's right. The president has ordered cutbacks in spending on public health grants, and these are grants that have already been appropriated and allocated by Congress, but they've just stopped distributing that money. There are cuts in federal funding to education. Of course, the long-range plan is to just completely dismantle the U.S. Department of Education and send parts of it, its functions, into other federal agencies. And then Attorney General Kwame Raoul, of course, has been involved in numerous multi-state lawsuits filed in federal courts around the country with other state attorneys general trying to block many of these. They've been fairly successful, at least in the early stages, in getting temporary injunctions, preliminary injunctions to block them. But it's, it's like whack-a-mole. You stop one here and another one pops up the next morning, such as tariffs, which could have a big impact on the Illinois economy.
And another one, of course, would be there's been rumored to be a big cut in the way that the federal government deals with the Medicaid program for the poor. There's one, if it goes to the extent, I think it was $800 billion over a period of time, you could see as many as 700,000 Illinoisans removed from the Medicaid rolls because of, that would basically end the Affordable Care Act extension.
Or even more than that, yeah. During the Obama administration, when they passed the Affordable Care Act, one of the elements of that was expanding Medicaid for what's called the working poor, the people who make too much money to qualify for traditional Medicaid, but they don't make enough to buy private insurance even from their employer. So they expanded Medicaid to take those people in. There are about 700,000 people in that category. The federal government pays 90% of the cost of that. If Congress should take action, and there seems to be a lot of desire to take action to eliminate that part of the Affordable Care Act, that would be, Illinois has a trigger law that says as soon as the federal government stops paying that 90%, we drop those people off of the state Medicaid program. So those people could lose insurance very quickly.
And the impact would not only be on those who lose insurance, but it would also impact healthcare providers, specialists all over the state of Illinois.
Yeah, that program had a big impact in reducing the number of uninsured in Illinois and in other states that took part in that program. Those people would immediately become uninsured again, which increases uncompensated care in hospitals and clinics and all kinds of other healthcare providers.
We've got about 30 seconds left, so that is the next big shoe that could drop and have a massive impact.
Yeah, Medicaid is a big part of the overall state budget. Between Medicaid and K through 12 education, you're talking about close to 40%, 50% of all the general revenue fund budget that the state of Illinois spends.
Peter Hancock of Capital News Illinois, thank you so much for your time on Illinois Lawmakers and your unique perspective on the goings-on here at the Capitol.
Good to be here.
Our newsmaker interview on this edition of Illinois Lawmakers is Senate Republican leader John Curran of Downers Grove. Good to have you back on the program, leader.
Nice to be back, Jak.
I didn't get a chance to talk to you to get your take on Governor Pritzker's budget proposal for next fiscal year. I think it's around $55.2 billion thereabouts in general fund spending. He says it's a balanced budget, doesn't call for any general tax increases. You have some questions about how that budget went together.
Yeah, well, Jak, I would tell you I was not a fan of the speech at all. I thought it was way too hyper-partisan, the second half of the speech, rhetoric-wise. You know, the governor, but in the budget he's proposed, spending would be increased 37% from when he first took office. That it should be a concern to all Illinoisans. You know, we've got to make sure that we, you know, we're not going to be able to keep up with that type of year-over-year spending increase. I would say I thought the governor, of all the budgets I've observed him propose, this was the most prudent. I thought the governor made some very good initial steps in proposing to rein in some programmatic cost and spending that he had supported previously and put it in place. And I think that shows, you know, sound, you know, fiscal policy in terms of reining it in, because that spending arc is not sustainable.
What were some of the particular areas that you were concerned about as far as the reining in spending?
Well, I mean, the free health care for the undocumented immigrant working age population. The governor ending that program, or proposing to end that program. That is simply something Illinois taxpayers cannot afford, and that is something that we don't see any of our competing states or neighboring states asking their taxpayers to shoulder. So I think the governor made a prudent choice in reining that in.
There were some questions back in the fall as to whether the revenue projections would continue in the black. At one point, the governor's own Office of Management and Budget was talking about a $3.2 billion deficit. Those numbers seem to have turned around. Are those numbers, are you confident in them?
Well, you know, we have two different sets of numbers now. That we got numbers after the governor's budget proposal from the legislative branch that was, you know, showed a bigger deficit. You know, certainly right now we're looking at something closer to $2 billion, but under $2 billion. But that's a moving target. Fortunately, we're going to get another read on that before we actually pass a budget and get a projection. But those are projections, so we've got to make sure we're conservative in our approach, so we don't get ourselves into trouble next fiscal year with an implemented budget and ultimately the revenue's not there to support it.
What kinds of advice will Republicans be able to give this session in terms of their own feedback into the budget making process? Obviously the party's in the minority in the Senate, but you have a lot of ideas on how things should go in your view.
Well, I mean, the most important role we're going to play is, I mean, we represent the geographic majority of the state. We want to make sure that all parts of the state we represent have voice in that budget process. It's incredibly important. Without our robust participation, there's no guarantee that we're going to get a budget that truly reflects and serves all of Illinois. So that's the process that we're concentrating on.
Every session is a little different than others, but this year there's been something that is kind of beyond the state's control. The Trump administration is asking for money to come back to Washington in terms of billions of dollars in federal operating funds. I saw that there was something like $477 million was taken back from the Illinois Department of Public Health and Human Services. How does your party how does the Senate Republican caucus react to what Washington's doing?
Well, look, we're focused on the fiscal health of Illinois. We want as much dollars from the federal government to flow to Illinois. It's the governor and our congressional and U.S. Senate office holders' responsibility to make sure Illinois is not left behind and is getting its competitive fair share of federal dollars. So, you know, we leave it to them to do that, and ultimately we're going to measure them on their success because we might have some questions on their approach. We want to make sure Illinois is treated fairly, but with that, we're going to have to deal, the federal government has not kind of reined in spending in the last several decades. And so this is something that Illinois has had to do from time to time. This is something now we see the federal government doing. It's going to have an effect in Illinois, and we've got to be in a strong fiscal position to deal with it.
I think Democrats and Republicans alike are particularly worried about programs like Medicaid, which provides health care for a lot of the working poor. What would happen if DOJ is successful at pulling back? I think the figure I heard was somewhere in the vicinity of $800 billion. What would be the impact on Illinois?
I think you see Republican governors, Democratic governors all pushing back on that. Medicaid funding from the federal government is incredibly important to the fiscal health of this state. We have to make sure that our Medicaid spending is only on those it's intended to service. We have to make sure that the program, so these expansions we've gone through are not sound fiscal policy, because ultimately, with this type of move by the federal administration, Illinois taxpayers are going to be left shouldering that, and that's not going to be sustainable.
Some other issues, of course, that are on everyone's mind: mass transit reform. One of the top issues this spring, at last word I saw, the deficit for RTA, Metro, CTA, PACE, somewhere like $750 million. They've been using COVID funds to keep things going, and that money's drying up. In your view, what would be the ideal reform package for mass transit in the state of Illinois? Because it's a huge deal to a lot of people.
It is, and we want to make sure that the collar counties don't get shut out of the process. And this doesn't just become something dominated by the city of Chicago in Cook County. So a lot of the reform proposals we've seen so far really upset that balance between the city, Cook County, suburban Cook County, and the collar counties. And I think it's incredibly important to maintain that balance. And at the same time, there has been a lot of, without actual reform and accountability in mass transit, it is hard to make the case for additional funding.
We're going to touch on that a little bit later in the program with the Senate Transportation Committee Chair. In terms of what they're proposing, or at least the one proposal that I've been hearing the most about, is trying to consolidate all of this into one super agency in terms of streamlining the process, cutting waste, making it more efficient. Does that, how does that match up with your priorities?
One, that process, we certainly want to have a strong RTA agency that we want to take advantage of consolidated procurement.
Yes.
We want to make sure that all the sub-agencies are actually properly approaching issues like fares. And we talk about the suburbs, and Metro has had numerous fare increases over the past decade and a half, and we look at the CTA, who is not, in ultimately looking more for taxpayer bailout. So I think we want to, if you're talking about one structure, one entity, where does that, mass transit needs in the collar counties is extremely different than it is in the city of Chicago.
Can this be accomplished in the next 2 months? I've been covering Springfield since 1991, and this comes up about every 7 or 8 years. Can it be accomplished in the time remaining before adjournment on May 31st?
Well, the short answer is yes, and it's something that should have been accomplished already, because just running to the end of COVID funds without getting these reforms put in place is not a good approach to public policy. We've let it go too long. We need to get it done.
Senate Republican Leader John Curran, thank you so much for your time on Illinois Lawmakers. We always appreciate having you drop by.
Thank you, Jack.
Thank you very much, sir. Up next on Illinois Lawmakers, we're joined by Democratic Senate Majority Whip Cristina Castro of Elgin. He also chairs the Senate Executive Committee. Good to have you back on the program.
Good to be back.
Spring session's at midpoint now. Bills are moving across the dome here. are out to the other building. You've seen a lot since 2017. The budget impasse under former Governor Rauner, all sorts of big things. How is this session shaping up for you? I never like to say it's a typical session because they're all different.
Nothing's ever typical in a session. I think one of the things that, this session is shaping up for me very positively. I obviously have two bills. One that deals, it's been one that the governor talked about in his own address, which is the cell phone ban bill,
Yes.
Which is now on the Senate floor, should move out of the chamber. It is a very important piece of legislation. Really, you have a lot of distracting things in the classroom. I've had several local teachers actually talk about other states that have implemented this legislation, this framework, and they said they need it. They have a lot of technology that's like disruptive, and then students don't focus. So this bill is, I always say, sets the floor, not the ceiling, for what school districts can do. It also allows school districts that already have policies in place to continue those policies, but if they want to add on, they can. And there's some exceptions built in as well. So I'm happy to be a sponsor of that and working with the governor's office. And I know it flew out of Senate Executive Committee unanimously with bipartisan support.
One other thing that's really been interesting this session is there's something going on outside of the control of those who vote here at the Capitol, and that takes the form of some of the Trump administration's cuts. We've seen a number of things like, I believe last week, $477 million from the Health and Human Services budget was cut. There's more money that might be cut from education. How are lawmakers in the Senate Democratic Caucus viewing this whole thing? I
think one of the things I joke, we take it a day at a time. Obviously, we can't predict what's going to happen or not happen in Washington, D.C. I think one of the things is we try to worry about what we can do here in Illinois. Obviously, our governor, our attorney general are obviously filing suit where it's needed, so to protect some of that funding coming in. So I think we have great budgeteers in the Senate that are obviously keeping an eye on that, but we also have our frontline folks with the governor and the AG really fighting for Illinoisans, fighting for Illinois, and making sure we still continue to get our funding from D.C., regardless of what chaos is going on at the federal government. But we are keeping one eye on it, and we are focusing on moving forward with the state budget.
One of the things that I think a lot of folks are concerned about is DOJ is talking about cutting something like $800 billion out of the Medicaid budget. We've got something like over 700,000 Illinoisans who are covered by the extension of the Affordable Care Act. That could be a massive issue for the state of Illinois.
It's a very troubling and could be a very massive issue by someone who's not elected to do anything other than to hurt people. I think one of the things that I would say from our standpoint, we're watching that very carefully. We are continuing to monitor that situation. The governor's office and the AG are pushing back as best they can. So we don't have the magic crystal ball. But every time something comes out of Washington, I know our staff analyze it. We still continue to move forward. But what I want to say to anyone watching is that we are keeping our eye very carefully, and we will defend this state and its citizens to the fullest extent of our ability.
One of the other issues that's topping the agenda this spring has to do with mass transit reform in the Chicagoland area, and part of that reaches down to your district in Elgin through PACE. What do you hope comes out of the discussions that are going on right now? There's been huge amounts of testimony on this.
Yeah, I think one of the things from my viewpoint of a suburban area I have the 6th largest city from the last census. It grew. I also have a very working class majority minority district with the biggest part of my population is Latino. Many of them use public transit, of course PACE, they use Metro, and I think one of the things that I have expressed to Senator Villavalam is when PACE has, we want to be mindful of how PACE is funded. We also have a lot of growth, want to make sure
that everything works out in the long run, and it's an extremely complicated issue.
Correct.
I'm going to have to end on that note because of time, but thank you so much.
No, sounds good.
Great. Our guest, Democratic Senate Majority Whip, Cristina Castro of Elgin. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Jack.
Mass transit reform is one of the issues topping lawmakers' agenda this spring as mass transit agencies in the northeastern part of the state are facing a projected deficit of something like $750 million. Our guest is Senate Transportation Committee Chairman Ron Villavalam of Chicago, Democrat from Chicago. Good to have you on the program. I understand you had an interesting hearing last night on the subject.
Yes, well, first and foremost, thank you again for having me. Yesterday marked the 8th Senate Transportation Committee hearing that we have had with over, at this point, close to 35 hours of testimony. This is an incredibly important issue for the Northeast Illinois region of Illinois, but honestly, our entire state, the Midwest, and I could argue the nation. As you know, every major public transit system in the nation is facing a fiscal cliff due to the massive decline in ridership that was expedited by the COVID-19 pandemic. And our goal is to work with all of the stakeholders, from business to labor to the environmental groups, but also the everyday rider, to ensure that we have a robust public transit system, not just for tomorrow or next year, but for decades to come, so that people are able to get from point A to point B with relative ease.
Well, the economy of the state of Illinois and in large part the region depends on everybody being able to go to work in the Chicagoland area and go to school, all of that back out into the suburbs. And it's an incredibly complex situation. You've got Metro, RTA, Chicago Transit Authority, you've got PACE for folks with disabilities. How does that all knit together, and how did we end up with a deficit at this high level?
Well, that's a great question, and I always start with, I wasn't here when this was all created, right? And when I say this governance model of 4 different agencies, 21 appointing authorities, 47 different appointments across the northeastern Illinois region, and so I always say, if we had the opportunity to go back to the early 80s or even the 70s, we would say this is not the way to approach this.
One of the things that's been discussed, and you've been a proponent of trying to create kind of a central agency on this that seamlessly goes across all of these different transit agencies to wring out more efficiencies and improve service.
Absolutely, and so that's what I think we're moving towards in terms of the consensus. Having a central authority to ensure that we eliminate the silos, to ensure that there is one network that is able to coordinate essentially, and make sure that when we talk about the issues of capital projects, fares, procurement, customer service, safety, service standards, that central authority, that central agency has the ability to bring it all together and make sure that those service boards are integrating and following the regional plan.
Do other states do a better job of this? Is there an example you could give that would work better?
Well, what I found is that every state and every major public transit system has their own model of governance, has their own model of service, and so forth. What I can tell you is this. We have, through our hearings, noticed that there has been no opposition to investing in public transit. Why? Because we know that if we provide safe, reliable, accessible, and integrated public transit, that it'll serve our region in a way that supports our economy, ensure equity, ensure that there's a quality of life for everybody.
How do you sell this, though, to downstate politicians? A lot of downstate is red, and a lot of folks in central and southern Illinois are going to look at this and go, I don't know why I should be paying anything for this, or should I pay anything at all?
I'm so glad you asked that question. This has always been, funding public transit has always been a statewide priority. We have engaged the Illinois Downstate Public Transit Association. In fact, they testified in committee last night as to their needs. They don't have the same massive level of decline in ridership. They still have needs, though, and they articulated those needs, and we're going to work to make those investments as well.
Well, we appreciate your time on this and all the hard work that's gone into it. Good luck, and we'll see where things go. We'll check in with you before the end of session.
Absolutely.
Thanks so much, Senator.
Thank you so much.
Continuing now on Illinois Lawmakers with Peter Hancock of Capital News, Illinois. Peter, the bills are getting ready to move to third reading. What do you expect next week's headlines will be coming out of the Capitol?
Oh, it could be anything, really. We might see some movement on some of the governor's initiatives. Some of his initiatives stalled, such as allowing community colleges to offer four-year degrees. That has stalled a little bit. But there are some other things. These will be the non-budgetary bills, just sort of the policy changes, the legal changes, the big stuff, the actual writing of the budget and the policies that go along with that will be in the second half of the session.
And that's pretty normal for any session of the Illinois General Assembly. You have to look at the April numbers, the revenue projections from the Committee on Government Forecasting and all that. So still more to come.
That's right.
As you were saying, the budget, of course, will come later in the session, as it normally does. In terms of other major issues like mass transit reform in the Chicagoland area, do you expect any action on that? A lot of rhetoric right now.
There is a lot of rhetoric around that, and it is a very big issue for a large segment of the Illinois population. The big challenge is trying to sell that issue downstate to people in Decatur and Peoria and Carbondale and Danville who don't really have a dog in that fight, and asking them to take risky votes to fix a transit system in the Chicago metropolitan area. A very complicated system, one that has a long history, problems of its own, but also problems related to the fact that our working patterns and our commuting patterns have changed, especially since the pandemic.
In brief, will there be any trade-offs that downstate might want to see in this package?
Oh, there are always trade-offs. I mean, this is kind of the sale barn of Illinois politics, where horses and cattle and everything else are traded. You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours.
Peter Hancock, thanks so much. As always, it's great to hear from you. That is it for this week's edition of Illinois Lawmakers. We will be back next week. Until then, so long from Springfield.